You have to try this meat. It's incredible. It really is. This stew is wonderful too.
I told you this gathering would be the best.
They gave her scraps while they shared the meat. In the compound of the man she had loved for 18 years, while the funeral pots boiled and mourners filled the air with false sighs, Amaka sat on a low wooden stool near the back wall like a stranger who had entered by mistake. The women inside the main canopy tore soft meat from steaming bowls and dipped it into rich pepper soup. The men at the high table chewed loudly, wiped oil from their lips, and argued about cows, land, and lorry papers as if the owner of all those things had been dead for a year. But Nnamdi had not yet been buried. His body was still in the cold room in town. His framed photograph was still fresh under the black cloth tied to the mango tree in front of the house. Yet his elder brother had already taken the front chair. His sister-in-law had already begun telling people which room belonged to whom. And his widow, the woman who had shared his bed, his worries, his prayers, and his hunger, was being fed the way people fed someone who no longer mattered. "Give her that one," Ngozi said, waving a careless hand toward a small dented plate. "It is enough. She cannot even swallow much in her condition." One of them added, "A widow should not be too comfortable. If you start feeding them like queens, they begin to forget that the man is gone." Another said, "At least they did not send her home yet." She lowered her eyes and accepted the plate with both hands. On it were scraps of rice that had stuck to the bottom of the pot, one piece of dry skin from the meat, and soup so thin it looked like water that had once met pepper from a distance. Inside the big tent, men were being served large bowls with thick cuts of cow meat, goat head, liver, and fish. But because grief had tied a knot in her chest and because every time she tried to stand near the main cooking area, somebody from her husband's family found a way to remind her that she was no longer the woman of the house in their eyes. "Sit there," Auntie Nwakigo had told her earlier, pointing to the back corner near the water drums. A mourning woman should not be too visible. Let the elders handle the front. The front. That was where her husband's brothers were now sitting like kings. The same men who used to arrive empty-handed whenever Nnamdi called for family meetings. The same men who borrowed money from him, begged him for school fees, asked him to settle fights, pay hospital bills, and rescue them when their foolishness caught up with them. Today they spoke as if blood alone had built the compound. Amaka's son, Obinna, stood near the doorway of the kitchen with wet eyes. He looked at the plate in his mother's hands, then toward the main canopy where his uncle Chibiz was laughing over a fresh serving of meat. "Why are they giving you that?" he asked in a small voice. "Come here," she said softly. "It is all right." At 16, Adiz had already seen enough of adults to know when cruelty was hiding behind custom. She stood behind her mother with her jaw tight and her hands shaking. "Let me go and bring another plate," she whispered. "They cannot do this to you in this house. Not in my father's house." "No." "But Mama, no." Adiz bent closer. "Why are you keeping quiet?" "Because he said they would cry with one eye and count with the other. Because he made me promise not to fight too soon. Because sometimes the truth needs room to reveal wicked people without interruption. Not now." Across the compound, Chibiz raised his voice above the noise of plates and people. "After the burial," he said, "we must do things properly. The documents should be checked. The lands must not be left floating. The transport business needs a strong hand. Women do not understand those things." Several men nodded, eager to agree with the loudest mouth at the table. Ifani, a younger cousin who had arrived that morning and had already started moving around with keys that did not belong to him, spoke next. "The house too," he said. "A compound this size cannot remain under confusion. The children are still small. The widow can stay somewhere modest until the family decides long-term arrangements." The widow. Not the woman who had stood in that same compound at sunrise for years, supervising workers, buying stock, balancing food for ceremonies, waking before everyone else and sleeping after everyone else. She lifted a spoonful of the cold rice, but before it reached her lips, she heard another voice. Bala, the driver, had returned from the gate and stopped when he saw her food. "See, Mama," he said quietly, using the respectful name the workers called her, "is this what they brought for you?" Before she could answer, Mama Yugo, the old cook, emerged from the kitchen carrying a larger tray meant for the front table. She also saw the plate and clicked her tongue with pain. "Chinik," she muttered. "In this same house. After all these years?" "Mama Yugo, carry what is in your hand and go where I sent you." The old woman straightened. Her eyes were old, but her anger was not. "Yes, I will go," she said, "but let it be known that food knows the hand that serves it. A day comes when a pot remembers." Ngozi snorted. "Do not start speaking in riddles because of ordinary rice." "Nothing is ordinary on a day like this," Mama Yugo replied. Amaka stared at her plate and thought of the last full meal she had eaten with Nnamdi. 6 days. 6 days between sharing a table with him and being given scraps behind his own house. That was how quickly greed could put on mourning cloth and begin eating. Amaka finally swallowed one small spoon of the cold rice. And as she forced it down, a memory rose in her chest like something that had waited behind tears for the right moment to return. He had sat on the veranda 3 weeks earlier, long before anyone knew death was watching him, and told her a truth that had sounded too heavy for an ordinary evening. At the time she had asked him why he was talking like that. Now, with a plate of scraps in her hands and his brothers sharing the best meat in front of the village, she understood. And before this day ended, every person in that compound would understand why he had spoken the way he did. To the village, Nnamdi had been the kind of man people remembered without effort. He did not pour money around just to be called generous. But if someone's roof collapsed in the rainy season, Nnamdi was the one who sent men and zinc sheets before the public appeal even reached church. If a school child was sent home for fees, he asked no questions before paying. If a widow's farm was overrun by weeds because her sons were still small, Nnamdi quietly sent laborers. When the old bridge near the stream broke and the village waited for the government that never came, he contributed cement, hired masons, and stood there in slippers and rolled-up trousers until the work was done. Then a small transport business that moved produce to the city. People who only saw the finished compound assumed he had come into life fully formed, already wearing success like a clean white shirt. They did not see the years he spent returning from the market after midnight. They did not see him sleeping in his first lorry during the rainy months because he could not afford both transport and lodging. They did not see the old scar on his shoulder from the time thieves attacked him on the Enugu road and he still refused to abandon his business. She had met him before the compound, before the tiled floors, before the 3 vehicles, before the respect that made people stand when he entered certain rooms. At the time he was only a determined man with tired eyes, careful speech, and a habit of helping others before helping himself. She had sold roasted corn near the junction where his first lorry used to pass. He would buy 2 cobs, ask for extra pepper, and then ask her if she had eaten. Later, when marriage came, it was not built on surprise wealth or sweet promises. On years when profit was small and pressure was large. Amaka knew where every block in that compound had come from. She knew which season's pepper profits had bought the water tank. She knew which transport contract had paid for the roofing sheets. She knew that the rear storeroom had once been a chicken pen before expansion. She knew that the front sitting room curtains had been sewn from cloth she and Nnamdi bought after traveling 6 hours by bus because city prices were cheaper. That was why the insults of his relatives burned so deeply. But she had stood with him in the dry years too. That was why, over time, he had stopped trusting his own people with certain matters. He loved family in the way responsible men often do. By helping them more than they deserved. Re was money to borrow. He knew which sister used respect as a ladder to climb into other people's property. He knew which cousins became active only when death, land, or inheritance was in the air. More than once, Amaka had asked him why he still kept, and some with Chief Nwafer, the one man in the village whose mouth could not be bought. She knew that several months earlier he had grown strangely deliberate. He spoke to Bala twice about where documents should go if anything happened on the road. He spent an afternoon with Chief Nwafer behind closed doors. And one evening, as the orange light of sunset spread across the veranda, he had told her something that felt too sharp to ignore. If death comes suddenly, he said, do not be surprised by the living. Why are you talking like this? You are not an old man. I am not afraid of dying. I am more concerned about what certain people will do before I am buried. She frowned. Your brothers? Then he said, some people see grief as an opening. They think sorrow weakens memory. They think a crying woman is an empty house. What are you saying? I am saying, he replied, that if anything happens to me, do not fight too early. Promise me that. Promise me. Let them talk. Let them gather. Let them show themselves before witnesses. Do not stop them too soon. What have you done? She asked. Only what a man should do when he knows both the people he loves and the people he is related to. She wanted to press further, but he smiled and squeezed her hand. You and the children will not be helpless. And now, on the day when his brothers were eating meat under his canopy and feeding her scraps behind his house, those words were the only thing keeping her from standing up and turning the compound upside down. He had left for town after lunch to inspect a newly leased warehouse and meet an accountant about a supply contract. She remembered the exact time because she had looked at the cracked wall clock in the kitchen while washing ugu leaves for dinner. He reminded her to send fuel money to the generator man in the morning. Then he laughed softly and said, Tell Adiz I did not forget her notebooks. That was the last full sentence she heard from him. There had been an accident on the express road near the filling station. By the time Amaka reached the emergency ward, his body was still warm, but his eyes had already gone somewhere she could not follow. People asking practical questions while her mind still refused the central fact. Then, before the burial date was even fixed, the shift began. Chibiz started sleeping in the front guest room for support. Ngozi took over the kitchen arrangement for the mourners. Auntie Nwakigo began advising Amaka on the dignity of widowhood, which mostly meant where to sit, what not to say, and how not to make independent decisions. They asked whether the farms were in his personal name or in a company structure. One cousin pretended he only wanted to secure the office. Another said cattle thieves often target mourning houses, so the livestock records should be checked immediately. One uncle said nothing directly, but he spent half an hour staring at the four-room wing at the side of the compound, measuring it with his eyes as if walls could already hear new owners speaking to them. By the third day, Chibiz had already started using phrases that made her skin tighten. In this family, decisions do not float. Property must remain under masculine oversight. The children are still too young to understand what is being protected for them. We must prevent outsiders from confusing what belongs to blood. That was the word he used for the woman his brother had married, lived with, built with, and entrusted with his children. When Amaka heard it, something hot rose in her throat. Not too soon. And because she watched, she saw things more clearly than the greedy ever realized. She saw Ifani slip into the home office with a bunch of copied keys. She saw Ngozi directing two girls to move expensive wrappers from Amaka's wardrobe to another room under the excuse of protecting them from disorder. She heard Auntie Nwakigo telling a group of women that once the burial was over, Amaka would likely return to her father's people for rest, as if the matter were already settled. She heard Chibiz on the phone at night saying, the trucks are the main thing. Once the papers are regularized, the rest will follow. Late one evening he found Amaka standing near the office door after everyone else had gone to bed. They want the keys, she said. I know. She looked at him. Did he leave anything with you? What? He only told me that if confusion started, I should not panic and I should inform Chief Nwafer before I opened my mouth to anyone else. So he knew. Bala lowered his voice. Madam, Master knew many things. I am tired. I know. I want to scream. I know. I want to tell them to get out. But you will not. Not yet. No, she said. Not yet. That same night, while the widow whispered her exhaustion to the driver by the office wall, inside the front room Chibiz was already speaking with confidence to two male relatives. The burial crowd will be large, he said. Once the elders hear that I am taking charge, everything will settle. Women make noise for a few days, then they go quiet when the structure is clear. One of the men asked, what if there are papers? Even if there are papers, family is family. No respectable widow drags elders into public struggle. She will bend. that sentence would return to him later like a stone thrown into the air. By the 5th day after Nnamdi's death, the compound no longer felt like a place of mourning. One woman arrived from the next town and headed straight for the storeroom before greeting Amaka. A male cousin inspected the poultry feed register with the seriousness of a shareholder, though nobody had called him. 2 nephews who had never visited unless there was Christmas meat began sleeping in the outer boys' quarters so they could help with security, or from the possibility that honesty might return before they finished counting. Old enough to hear the difference between concern and positioning. That afternoon she found her mother in the back room folding black clothes for the burial and said, "Mama, should I start packing our things?" Packing? Adiz looked ashamed for asking, but fear pushed her on. "I heard Auntie Ngozi telling somebody that after Saturday, we will not need all these rooms. She said Uncle Chibi's son can move into Father's office wing." "Did she say that where you were standing?" "No. I was passing the corridor." "And who was she talking to?" "Ifani." "Are we leaving?" "No. But what if they force us?" "They will not." "You sound sure." Amaka held that gaze, though her own heart was heavy. "I am choosing to be sure." Still, when Adiz left, Amaka sat on the bed and wept silently for the first time that day. In the next room, Obinna was drawing a lorry on the back of an old exercise book. When he came to show her, he had drawn his father in the driver's seat with a large smile. "Look," he said. "Daddy is coming home." And now even that simple grief was being crowded by ugly adult behavior. That evening, Mama Yugo found Obinna crying near the back steps. "What is it, my son?" He wiped his face badly. "Uncle Ifani said boys must become strong because women cannot keep property." The old woman bent slowly and looked him in the eye. "Listen to me. Property does not answer to noise. It answers to truth." He sniffed. "Will they send us away?" "No," she said more firmly than she felt. "And even if wicked people stand up for one day, they do not own tomorrow." She took him to the kitchen and tore a warm piece of bread for him before anybody else saw. Mama Yugo had worked for the Ease household for 11 years. She had entered when the kitchen was still a smoky attached shed and had stayed long enough to watch it become a tiled cooking block with proper shelves and water storage. She knew which bags of rice had been bought with which market profits. She knew that Amaka often reduced her own clothing money to pay school workers when transport payments were delayed. She knew that Chibi's family, who now strutted through the compound like resident royalty, had been carried more than once by Nnamdi's generosity. So every insult against the widow felt personal to her. Late that night she whispered to Bala near the back kitchen. "If justice does not speak on Saturday, my tongue will. Be careful." "I am old," she said. "I am tired of pretending not to hear wickedness. It will speak. You know something." "I know enough to wait." In another part of the compound, Ngozi was doing what cruel people often do best, performing concern while planning domination. She sat with some women under the side awning and spoke in the weary voice of someone carrying a burden for others. "My heart truly breaks for Amaka," she said. "But we must think ahead. A woman in grief can make poor decisions. The family must step in firmly." One woman asked, "Will she remain here?" "That depends on the elders. This kind of large property needs structure. Sentiment cannot run a transport business. Emotion cannot manage farmland. A widow should be protected from pressure." But one younger woman asked quietly, "Protected or removed?" Ngozi turned her face slowly and smiled in a way that contained no warmth. "Both can be the same thing." Word spread the way words always do in mourning houses. By the next morning several villagers had heard some version of the story. That the children would still be looked after, which is a phrase people use when they are preparing to steal from orphans politely. Because she was waiting for the hour her husband had prepared. The night before the funeral, rain fell lightly on the zinc roof and turned the compound into a place of muttering sounds. In that brief thin silence, Amaka sat alone on the veranda outside the room she had shared with Nnamdi. One of his white caps still hung on the peg by the door. His reading glasses were on the small table beside the chair where he used to sit after dinner and listen to the evening news. as if he might enter at any moment and ask why the lantern outside had not been brought in. Amaka held one of his shirts against her chest and let herself remember that evening on the veranda 3 weeks earlier in full. The smell of frying akara from the roadside reached the compound. He asked whether Adi's school transfer form had been completed. He asked whether the second freezer receipt had been filed. He asked whether Bala had repaired the rear gate hinge. Then after a pause he said, "Where is the red notebook?" Amaka had laughed. "Why? Bring it." "What is this?" "A habit," he said. "A man should know where his life is kept." "Nnamdi," she said slowly, "what is all this?" "If a man has built anything worth stealing, he should not assume tears will protect it." "Tell me properly." He said Chibiz had been asking too many questions lately about shares and titles. He said one cousin tried to copy a land survey document months earlier. He said he no longer trusted certain people to visit without counting things in their heads. Then he looked at her in a way she could never forget. "Amaka, listen carefully. If anything happens to me, grief will make you want to lock the gate and scream. Do not. Let them come? Yes. Let them insult me? If they choose to. Let them touch your things? Not everything. Some things are already where they should be. But let them reveal intention. Do not stop them before witnesses see their hands. Why should I allow wickedness? Because hidden wickedness is stronger than exposed wickedness," he said. "Once it comes into the open, it weakens. Will we be safe?" He held her gaze until she believed the answer before he spoke it. "Yes." Then he added, "Chief Nwaffer knows what to do. Barrister Okeke knows what to do. Bala knows enough. You are not alone, even if it feels that way for a few days." But Nnamdi only smiled the tired smile of a man who had carried responsibility too long and said, "Sometimes the dead must speak loudly because the living become deaf when property is near." Sitting alone on the veranda now, the night before his burial, Amaka pressed the shirt harder to herself and whispered into the darkness, "I have kept my promise." "Sorry, madam. I did not know you were outside." "It is all right." He stepped closer, holding a small phone and a folded paper. "What is that?" "This is not for me to explain fully. Chief Nwaffer sent word. He will arrive tomorrow before the main gathering starts. He said you must remain calm no matter what happens before noon." "Is that from him?" "It is only confirmation that the chief has the main packet and the recording device. This one is just a note for you. Tomorrow may be ugly before it turns." "It is already ugly," she said. "Yes. But ugly things often make the best witnesses." For the first time in days, a real breath left her chest. "Thank you." He was a good man. He still is. They are busy before dawn, but the busyness is weighted. Even the chickens seem confused by the number of feet crossing the compound before sunrise. At 4:30 the fire was already lit behind the kitchen. At 5, women from the church came with wrappers tied high and sleeves rolled up for work. At 5:30, the hired canopy men arrived to adjust chairs and retie loose fabric after the light rain. At 6, the first bus from Nnamdi's mother's village entered through the gate. And from that moment, the compound belonged less and less to grief and more to spectacle. The front yard filled with coolers, benches, drums of water, and the hurried authority of people who always become experts around death. No softness in her face beyond the softness grief had carved there. Women came in, hugged her, cried at her shoulder, and asked whether she had slept. Some were there mostly to inspect how disorder was unfolding. Ngozi dressed like a woman hosting an event she expected to remember proudly. Her voice traveled across the compound as if volume could establish ownership. "Put those drinks in the side room." "No, not that table. The elders' table must remain near the front." "Who moved that tray?" "Somebody should check the goat meat." "The best cuts must not finish before the titled men are served." By 8, the men had started gathering under the big canopy. Chibiz wore a long black senator outfit and the expression of a man already practicing authority. He stood at the gate receiving people, shaking hands too firmly, speaking on behalf of the family as though Nnamdi's children and widow were ceremonial decorations. Thank you for coming. Yes, we are holding ourselves strong. We are managing. Yes, the family is united. She saw Ifani carrying a small notebook and quietly writing names of who brought envelopes and who brought drinks, as though the morning register itself had become part of his future accounting. She saw Auntie Nwakigo directing women where to sit, making sure Amaka remained visible enough to be pitted but not central enough to seem in control. She saw two nephews near the side store already discussing which freezer would be moved after the final prayers. Everywhere she turned, ownership hovered in the air like flies around fruit. Whatever greed had been talking had to step back before the fact of death itself. When the hearse entered and the white coffin was brought out, a cry tore from Amaka so deep that even people who had been busy gossiping grew still. Only the unbearable shape of a man reduced to a box and flowers. That was the one mercy of death. It could still silence thieves for a moment. After the brief service, after the prayers, after the choir sang and the pastor spoke about dust returning to dust, the body was lowered. And as soon as that final sacred duty ended, the living began turning back toward what greed had come for. By the time people returned to the compound for the main meal, Chibiz was already speaking again about arrangements. The crowd is large. We must keep order. After the food, only family and elders should remain for internal discussion. Certain keys should be centralized immediately. When food was finally served, it happened exactly as Nnamdi had predicted and exactly as Amaka had feared. At the edge of that abundance, Amaka stood waiting beside two churchwomen who assumed someone would soon lead her to an appropriate place near the front. Instead, Ngozi appeared with a smile too sweet to be honest. Amaka, come this way. She led her not toward the canopy but around it, past the water drums, past the stacks of plates, toward the back wall where a few stools had been arranged for kitchen helpers and latecomers. Ngozi, why? Please do not start today. The front is crowded. It is better for you to sit quietly here and mourn in dignity. In dignity? Yes. Besides, widows should not eat heavily before visitors finish. There are moments when one insult gathers all the others inside it. Ngozi read something dangerous in her face and quickly added, "You know I am trying to protect your image." Then she turned and called to a girl carrying plates. "Give her one there." The girl, nervous and embarrassed, handed Amaka a plate that looked as though it had been assembled from leftovers after everyone else's portions were decided. A spoon of rice stuck together from the pot's edge. Not too soon. Mama, Uncle Chibiz has two meats. His child's voice cut through the noise sharper than accusation would have. One older woman muttered, "Children notice everything." From where she sat, she could see the main table clearly. Chibiz was leaning back with his hand on his stomach, talking loudly between mouthfuls. Auntie Nwakigo was telling some women that young widows must be guided firmly or they forget family structure. Ngozi was moving from guest to guest, adjusting plates, smiling, serving, glowing with the cruel energy of a person who enjoys humiliation when she can perform it respectably. And all the while, the widow of the house was behind the canopy eating scraps. Just positioned exactly where her reduced status could be seen. Bala appeared near the kitchen entrance and stopped short when he saw where she had been placed. He simply looked from her plate to the front canopy and back again. "Are these people mad?" She hissed. "Hush," Bala warned. But the old woman's fury had ripened beyond easy control. "She cooked in those pots for years," Mama Yugo said through her teeth. "She paid my granddaughter's hospital fee from market money when Master was away. She built this kitchen with him. And today they feed her like a beggar behind the wall?" A younger kitchen helper whispered, "Mama, people are looking." "Let them look." "Please," she said. "Madam, please." Mama Yugo turned away before her own anger made a scene. When chairs, plates, serving order, and words all worked together to reduce a person in the very place where they once stood with honor. Amaka lifted a spoon of rice and forced herself to swallow. She tasted salt then and realized tears had reached her mouth. Across the yard, one of the pastors saw her, frowned, and half rose from his seat as if he might intervene. Respectable wickedness often depends on people choosing convenience over confrontation. Chibiz, speaking loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, said, "After today we will sit as men and settle this property. The children can remain under family protection, but the house itself must return to proper control. Emotion is not inheritance." One man said, "True. A compound like this cannot be left loose." Another added, "Especially with transport money involved." And then Ifani, eager to impress his senior, laughed and said, "Once the burial closes, the widow should carry what is personal and leave the main rooms. That is how confusion is prevented." The knowledge of years no one could erase by speaking loudly. Then Bala, standing near the rear path, caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. And because she had already survived this far, Amaka remained seated on the low stool with scraps on her plate while the greedy exposed themselves more completely than any enemy could have accused them of doing. After the main round of eating, when many guests were drowsy from food and the first wave of sorrow had settled into tired conversation, Chibiz stood up. He folded his hands over his stomach and wore the solemn face of a man about to speak wisdom. "My people," he began, "today is a painful day for the Ease family. A pillar has fallen. A hard-working man has gone. But even in pain, family must remain orderly. A house does not bury confusion and then wake up to chaos. As the eldest surviving brother, I will, with the guidance of elders, oversee the immediate protection of my brother's assets, businesses, lands, and home until proper internal distribution is concluded." He did not say, "if." He said, "will." Some people nodded reflexively because he was loud, male and standing. Chief Nwaffer had still not arrived, and Chibiz mistook that delay for an opening. "His children are our children," he said. "His widow is under the care of the family. Nobody will suffer. But let nobody think grief suspends tradition. The old cloak greedy people wear when they want theft to sound sacred." One elderly man at the front asked, "Has this been discussed with the chief?" "The chief respects family process. We will inform him accordingly." That answer was carefully built to sound settled without proving anything. "Some administrative steps have already begun," he said. "We have secured the office wing, the vehicle keys, and the outer stores so that nothing is misplaced." Ngozi stood near the women and added in a softer voice that somehow carried just as far, "Everything we do is for peace. A grieving woman should not be burdened with pressure." Mama Yugo stood in the shade with her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together by force. Then, just as Chibiz opened his mouth to continue speaking about next steps, the sound of a vehicle at the gate cut through the compound. He stepped out of the vehicle in a plain but spotless traditional outfit, his walking staff in one hand and a brown leather folder tucked under his arm. And behind them came Barrister Okeke from town, carrying a sealed envelope and a small speaker device in a black bag. The compound, which moments earlier had been busy swallowing food and bold claims, became still. Even the children sensed that something larger than noise had entered. "Chief, you're welcome." I know what you were just doing," the chief said. Over the widow on the low stool with a poor plate in her lap. When his gaze rested on Amaka, something in his face hardened. "Bring a chair for the widow." "In front." He rushed, brought one of the better chairs from under the canopy and placed it near the center. Chief Nwaffer looked at Amaka and said, "Daughter, come and sit here." There are moments when a whole gathering understands, without formal announcement, that power has shifted. She carried her small plate in both hands as she crossed from the back wall to the front. When she reached the chair, Mama Yugo hurried forward, took the plate from her, and set it aside with an expression that made clear it should never have existed. "I came today first to honor the dead," he said. "But I have also come because the dead himself made arrangements for this hour. Chief, whatever needs discussing can be done privately after." "Sit down," Chief Nwaffer said. The chief looked to Barrister Okeke, who stepped forward and produced the sealed envelope. "Before his death," Chief Nwaffer said, "Nnamdi Ease deposited with me and with council a written declaration and a recorded message, to be presented publicly if any confusion arose over the treatment of his wife, his children, his house, his lands, his business interests, or his estate." Even those at the back who had not heard the earlier claims leaned in. "Open it." The crack of the broken seal sounded louder than it should have. Perhaps because guilty people hear paper as thunder when truth is inside it. I, Nnamdi, being of sound mind and full legal capacity at the time of writing, make this declaration in anticipation of any sudden death, incapacity, or attempt at unlawful interference with the welfare of my wife, my children, my household, or my estate. First, I state plainly that my wife, Amaka, is not a visitor in my house, nor a temporary occupant under family mercy. She is my lawful wife, my full partner in the labor by which my household, businesses, farms, and properties were built, and the first custodian of all that I leave behind. Second, the family compound at Nnamdi, including the main building, office wing, rear stores, outer kitchen, borehole structure, and attached land, is by deed and declaration vested in the name of Amaka in trust for herself and our children. The chief lifted one hand and the noise dropped again. My transport business interests, including all registered lorries, licenses, associated maintenance assets, and supply contracts, are to be administered by Amaka with professional support from my appointed accountant and legal advisor. No sibling, cousin, in-law, or extended relation shall assume control by custom, noise, or self-appointment. Someone at the side let out a small involuntary sound. Fourth, my leasehold farms, poultry operations, town shops, bank accounts designated in the attached schedule, and all trade proceeds standing in my name or company arrangements are to remain under the sole authority of Amaka, save where specific management instruction is attached herein. That tiny pause tortured the greedy more than the reading itself. Then came the sentence that changed mere surprise into fear. Fifth, because I know the character of some among my relations, and because death often attracts people whose tears are thinner than their appetite, I declare this. Any person related to me by blood or marriage who, after my death, threatens, humiliates, insults, pressures, dispossesses, manipulates, or seeks to reduce the dignity and lawful standing of my wife, shall forfeit any gift, support, consideration, or share I may otherwise have intended for such person. Ha! Did you hear that? God sees. So he knew them. Chief, this wording, sit. Let it be recorded that disrespect is also theft when it is used to push a rightful person out of place. 6. My children, Adiz and Obina are to remain under the direct care, residence, and authority of their mother, Amaka. No relative shall remove them from their home, school, or inheritance pathway under the excuse of family protection. Obina looked up at his mother as if language itself had suddenly become a shield. Barrister Okeke looked toward Chief Nwafor, who nodded for him to proceed. 7th. Bala Muhammad, my driver, and Mama Yugo, my cook, are to remain in service if willing, with improved terms specified in the attached schedule, because loyalty during life should not become suffering after death. That is how the truly responsible distinguish themselves even after death. Finally, if at any gathering after my death my wife is publicly dishonored in the handling of food, seating, speech, clothing, access, or title, let that gathering know that it has dishonored me also, and let those responsible be treated thereafter as people with no moral standing in my household. All eyes moved at once to the small rejected plate still sitting near the side path where Mama Yugo had placed it. In that instant, the whole compound understood that even the scraps had become evidence. Then he asked calmly, should I stop there or should we hear the man himself? Play it, he said. Barrister Okeke opened the black bag and removed a small speaker. Then the unmistakable sound of a man clearing his throat. My people, the recording began, if you are hearing this, then God has called me before I expected, and some of you are gathered in my compound in the name of mourning. I pray that among you are people who truly came to honor me. But I am not foolish. I know that death invites two kinds of visitors. Those who come with tears. And those who come with appetite. The compound was so quiet that distant birds could be heard beyond the gate. I am speaking plainly because plain speech is sometimes the only respect wickedness understands. Amaka, his voice said, softer now, if they have made you cry before this message is played, forgive me for leaving you among people whose hearts I measured correctly. My wife did not meet me in comfort. She met me in struggle. She stood when money was thin. She stood when roads failed. She stood when contracts delayed. She stood when my body was tired and my name was still small. Any person who speaks as if she is a visitor in what we built together is either a liar, a fool, or a thief. And to my brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, and in-laws, let me also say this. Help I gave you in life was from goodwill, not from blindness. I knew many of your habits. I knew who greeted me and counted my roof with the same eye. I knew who asked after my health only when transport money had entered. I knew who respected me sincerely and who respected my table. I did not stop being your relation, the voice went on, but I also did not stop being a man who could write. If any of you arrive before I am buried and begin discussing my land, dividing my keys, moving around my stores, or seating my wife like a servant while you eat my meat, know this. The village has now seen your face. Chibi's jaw clenched so hard a vein stood at his temple. Chibi's, my brother, if you are among those speaking loudly in front, remember the years you stood in my office asking for rescue. Remember the school fees I paid. Remember the debts I covered. Do not let borrowed seniority push you into shame. Ngozi, the recording said next, hospitality is not ownership. If you are serving food in my compound, serve with sense. A woman who humiliates another woman on the day of burial is not honoring tradition. She is advertising envy. And if scraps are what they gave Amaka while others shared the meat, let those scraps bear witness against them longer than any argument would. What had been hidden inside private arrangement was now nailed to public truth. Chief Nwafor did not need to rescue anyone from exaggeration. But some of the most devastating justice arrives in silence first. The silence where everybody realizes they cannot pretend not to know. Then at the rest of the relatives who had sat confidently only minutes earlier. What has been said in writing has legal force, he said. What has been said in the recorded message has moral force. And what has been displayed in this compound today has witness. Record the proceedings. From this hour no person is to remove, assign, lock, relocate or claim any item, room, key, vehicle, paper, produce, livestock, account, or household asset except under the direct instruction of Amaka and in accordance with the schedules held by council. The keys. The keys, the chief repeated. With weak fingers, the cousin stepped forward and placed the bunch into the lawyer's hand. You stood in this gathering and declared control over what was not yours. Chief, with respect our customs, do not carry custom in your mouth like a thief carries a lantern. Tradition is not permission to disgrace a widow and seize a brother's labor. One old man struck his walking stick on the ground. Yes. Another said, he has spoken. Let every person hear clearly. A woman who built with her husband is not a temporary tenant. Children whose father has just been buried are not prey. Mourning is not a market for inheritance thieves. Chief, perhaps things were misunderstood. The food arrangement was only because of space and confusion. Lie again, the old cook said, her voice shaking with righteous fury. Tell them how you said the best cuts must not finish before titled men are served. Tell them how you pointed to that poor plate and said it was enough for her. Tell them. A young church woman from the serving line lifted one hand timidly. It is true, she said. I was there. Another followed. I heard it too. Then a pastor added from the side, I saw where the widow was seated and I was ashamed. One of the nephews who had moved into the boys' quarters slipped away toward the back. Auntie Nwakigo began muttering that she had only been following what was already arranged. Read the attached forfeiture schedule. And now, by Nnamdi's own design, much of it was gone. As each name was read beside each forfeited benefit, the crowd understood the scale of what greed had cost them. Ngozi lost the shop capital intended in her name through a cooperative contribution. By the time the reading ended, the people who had entered the day feeling powerful looked as though the ground itself was rejecting them. The chief held it up for the crowd to see. This, he said, is the measure they gave the wife of the dead while they shared his meat. Let this plate be remembered longer than their excuses. For several seconds after the chief lowered the plate, nobody spoke. Daughter, if you have words, speak them. At the children who had watched adults teach them ugly lessons all afternoon. Then at the grave beyond the gate where fresh earth still covered the man who had loved her enough to prepare for this exact hour. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but clear. I did not keep quiet because I am weak, she said. I kept quiet because my husband knew this day better than I did. He told me that if death came suddenly, some people would come to mourn him while reaching for what he built. He told me not to stop them too early. A breeze moved the black cloth tied to the mango tree. So I watched. She turned toward Chibiz and Ngozi, but there was no screaming in her face. I watched who sat where. I watched who touched which keys. I watched who comforted my children and who frightened them. I watched who remembered that a dead man was being honored and who remembered only his rooms, his vehicles, his stores, and his accounts. I sat behind my own canopy and ate scraps in the house I helped build. I heard myself called a widow as if that word erased the years before this week. I heard plans made for where my children would sleep before their father had even fully entered the ground. My husband is not a goat to be carved before burial. He is not a tree that fell so branches could be stolen. He is not silence for wicked people to hide inside. He has spoken. The law has spoken. The chief has spoken. She looked at the poor plate still in Chief Nwafer's hand. And because I know grief better than greed, I will say this. I will not answer humiliation with humiliation. I will not drive anyone mad with revenge. But no one will remove me from my husband's house. No one will scatter my children. No one will use tradition to cover hunger for what is not theirs. What answered her instead was a deep sound from the gathering. The human sound of agreement when dignity is restored. Well spoken. The chief directed that all unofficially seized keys be collected and listed. The office wing was opened in the presence of the lawyer, 2 elders, Bala and Amaka. The side room where Ngozi had moved wrappers and fabrics for safekeeping was inspected, and everything was recorded and returned. The nephew who had tried to shift into the boys' quarters was told to pack immediately. Ifani, whose confidence had collapsed into sweat and silence, was made to account for the notebook where he had been tracking gifts and items. The chief took it and handed it directly to council. Anything related to this funeral, Chief Nwafer said, belongs in transparent record, not family pockets. Some of the villagers who had been spectators only an hour earlier now became living safeguards. That is another thing about public justice. It recruits witnesses into responsibility. Men who had sat quiet earlier now volunteered to help secure the warehouse papers until formal handover. A church elder offered to accompany the accountant on Monday. 2 women from the parish stayed beside Amaka like pillars, not because she suddenly needed their strength to stand, but because they wanted the compound to see that she was no longer isolated. As for Chibiz, he tried one last time to recover dignity. He approached the chief in private tones and said, "Whatever has happened, let it not destroy family completely. We can settle these matters quietly." Family was not destroyed by the reading of a letter, he said. It was damaged by what you did before the letter had to be read. Women who had admired her controlled hospitality earlier now avoided her. No one wanted to stand too close to the woman the dead man himself had rebuked for serving scraps to his wife. One of her own friends whispered, not softly enough, "Too much eagerness always disgraces itself." By evening, the people who had come planning to own pieces of Nnamdi's life were leaving with their wrappers heavy from shame instead. The chief instructed that the next day a formal household and business review would begin under legal supervision. He directed that no one from extended family sleep in any room they had occupied temporarily without fresh permission. He stated clearly that any continued harassment of Amaka or the children would be treated as defiance of both legal declaration and village authority. Then he did something small that mattered more than many speeches. He told the serving line to bring Amaka a fresh meal. And he asked that her children be served beside her. She set it before Amaka and said, "Madam, forgive the house." "The house is not guilty," she said softly. "Only hearts are." Obinna looked at the full plate and then at his mother as if he had witnessed a miracle that was both simple and vast. Adiz exhaled for what felt like the first time all week. That night, after the last chairs were stacked and the final borrowed coolers removed, the compound sounded different. The room where Nnamdi used to sleep was still full of absence. For the first time in days, Amaka could sit in the front veranda without feeling watched by people planning her reduction. Adiz slept near Obinna on a mat in the sitting room because neither child wanted distance that night. Mama Yugo remained in the kitchen wing until late, preparing warm tea no one really needed but everyone accepted. Bala moved through the compound checking locks with quiet satisfaction. Around 9, Chief Nwaffer came to sit with Amaka briefly before leaving. They sat in the place where Nnamdi had once spoken his warning. "These are certified copies for immediate use," he said. "The originals remain with counsel and in the bank file." "Thank you. You kept your discipline." "He asked me to." "I know. He came to me 3 months ago." "He was that worried?" "He was not worried in the way frightened men worry. He was clear." "There is a difference." He said, "Chief, my people are not all bad, but some become smaller than themselves when property is near. If I die, do not let my wife discover alone what I already know." That sounds like him. "Yes. One more thing. Tomorrow many people will come to advise you. Some sincerely. Some because they still hope to enter through another door. Listen respectfully. Decide carefully. A widow with papers is still surrounded by mouths. I understand." The moonlight touched the courtyard where, only hours earlier, she had sat with Scraps on a low stool like an unwanted person. Now that same courtyard held silence, documents, and the aftertaste of truth. "I did not stop being a man who could write." Then she looked toward the grave beyond the wall and whispered, "You wrote loudly enough." By Friday the lawyer had filed the necessary notices to freeze unauthorized access and update operational controls exactly as Nnamdi's instructions required. The bank manager, a careful man who had respected Nnamdi in life, visited personally and expressed condolences before confirming the legal transitions already on record. They did not know Nnamdi had done the boring powerful work too. She did not pretend to know every detail on day one. And each time some doubtful person looked at her as if expecting confusion, she gave the calm answer of someone who had been learning long before widowhood made it official. She knew when money came in and where it often leaked. She knew which driver delayed remittance and which supplier lied about shortages. She knew that one farm plot yielded better after late planting and that the town shop near the junction had higher profit on market eve. They had only been dismissed as invisible because too many people refused to see women's work unless death forces a reckoning. One afternoon she found the small dented plate in the side kitchen where Mama Yugo had kept it. "Why did you save this?" she asked. The old cook answered, "Some things are too shameful to throw away quickly. They must teach first." Adiz touched the edge of the plate and said, "I will never forget that day." "You should not," Mama Yugo replied. "Not for bitterness. For wisdom." As for the greedy relatives, their downfall unfolded in different ways. Men who had earlier nodded at his claims now avoided taking sides publicly. His unfinished building, which he had hoped Nnamdi would help complete, remained unfinished. Ngozi's plan for shop capital vanished with the forfeiture clause, and women in the market spoke of little else for weeks. Ifani tried to spread a story that the widow had used law to insult custom, but it gained no serious ground because too many witnesses had seen the scraps, heard the reading, and watched the dead man himself dismantle the lie. Whenever anyone mentioned the case, people said the same thing first. They gave her scraps while they shared the meat. 40 days after the burial, Amaka held a modest thanksgiving and feeding in Nnamdi's memory. Just a dignified gathering for church members, workers, neighbors, poor families, and the old men who used to greet Nnamdi at the roadside bench near the market. The best meat would be served first to the elders, the workers, the widows, and the children. When Mama Yugo heard the instruction, she smiled in a way that looked like healing. Amaka sat where she belonged, not at the center because she needed praise, but in full view because nobody was pretending she was less than the woman of the house. So did the accountant and several workers from the transport line. But everyone understood that entry was now by grace, not entitlement. During the short remarks before food, she stood and spoke only a few words. "My husband believed that a house should feed with honor," she said. "Today we remember him by doing that." Then she looked across the gathering and added, "Grief showed me many faces. I thank God for the ones that stayed human." At one point Amaka saw a widow from the next compound receiving a large piece of meat and wiping tears from her eyes because nobody had fed her properly since her own husband died years earlier. Later, after most guests had left, She walked alone to Nnamdi's grave with one white flower in her hand. The compound behind her smelled of wood smoke and finished cooking. She stood by the grave and laid the flower down. For a few days, she said quietly, they thought silence meant emptiness. But you left words behind. She stayed there a little longer, not asking for signs, not begging the earth for what it could not return. Just standing in the steadiness that comes when a person survives both grief and attempted erasure. And that, Amaka knew now, was sometimes the sharpest answer to greed. Chief Nwaffer, when asked privately what he thought, gave the simplest answer. He loved his wife enough to prepare for wickedness. It had sat under the main canopy and eaten the best meat. It had pushed the widow to the back and offered her scraps as if dignity could be reduced by plate size. It had spoken loudly because it assumed grief would be too weak to resist. And sometimes, when they know the hearts around them too well, they can leave words timed like thunder. So when people retold the story, they did not begin with bank accounts or legal declarations. They said, they gave the widow scraps while they shared the meat. And then they finished with the truth that turned shame into warning. The chief read her husband's message, and the whole village saw who had really come to mourn and who had come to feed. If there was a lesson in all of it, it was not only that justice wins. Sometimes it sits quietly on a low stool and lets wickedness speak until every witness is in place. Sometimes it allows the cruel to fill their own mouths before asking them to answer. And when it finally rises, it does not always need to shout. Sometimes it only needs a sealed envelope, a remembered promise, and the voice of a man who refused to let death make his family defenseless. That is why, long after the funeral tents were gone and the cooking fires had cooled, mothers in the village still told their daughters that dignity must never be confused with helplessness. That is why workers in the E's household served with deeper loyalty than before. That is why children who heard the story learned early that custom without conscience is only decorated greed. And that is why, in the house where Amaka once sat with scraps behind the wall, no widow was ever again served from the bottom of the pot while others shared the meat. And truth, when it finally took the front chair, did not stand up again.